I have a very great episode and a super cool guest. His name's Thomas Hodgkinson, and he wrote the book, How to Be Cool. Now, you might think that's an arrogant title for anybody to write, but let me tell you, I have personal proof that Thomas actually is cool, even though he didn't add himself as one of the cool people in his book. And I'm going to tell you why. So I reached out to who I thought was this author of a particular book that I wanted to interview. I didn't know about the book, How to Be Cool, when I did it. And the author's name of this other book was Thomas Hodgkinson. And so I looked up the name on some social media account and sent my query and said, listen, I really want to interview you. And I got this lovely note back from this guy over here on the other side of the screen that said, well, my name's Thomas Hodgkinson, but I think you're looking for the other one, the other guy. And I thought, okay, got it. And then seconds later, another email came in and it said, and by the way, here's the other guy's email. Well, in that split second, every aspect of me said, whoa, this guy is really cool that he went that extra step and did that for me. So I immediately looked him up online and found out he's the author of How to Be Cool. So how cool is that? Like, seriously. Thomas, welcome.
You're very welcome.
Thanks. You know,
you're happy to help.
You know, your book came out a few years ago, but it is truly timeless based on the characters you highlight, who you said you thought was the coolest person on the planet, which I am not going to, or in history, which I'm not going to disclose. People are just going to have to read it to get to that conclusion, which I thought was most fascinating and happened to agree with, would be the person I'd want to have dinner with if I could choose all the people throughout history. And there have been a lot of interesting ones. But how'd you come about this for a book? Because you've written a lot, including How to Sound Cultured, which I definitely need a copy of next.
I'm sure that's not true. I don't believe that for a second, Diane. But thank you for saying that. How did I come to write it? I mean, one thing, it just seemed to me a little bit like you said earlier on. It seemed like a challenge, or it seemed like such a bad idea that I thought I'd better have a go. Because I mean, one of the things which I try to navigate a little bit in the book is that there's a problem with talking about coolness and writing about coolness, is that it's almost kind of in itself impossible to define. As soon as you define it, you actually decoolify it, and then cool will become something else. It's always moving. So I thought that was a challenge that I liked, that appealed to me. You know, it's the fact that for most of my life, and you know, to this day, I don't feel personally cool at all.
I have to disagree with you on that, because only a super cool person would take the time to send a stranger an email address for someone else. That's very sweet of you to say.
Nevertheless, in terms of how I've always felt, and you know, this would I guess go back to when I was quite young, which would be the first time that you would come into contact with the very idea of coolness. When you're a kid, you might not really be aware that that's even a thing, but at some point you become aware that it's a thing. And my awareness dawned, I suppose, like a lot of people, you know, in my teens. And I very quickly discovered that if there was one thing that I wasn't, it was cool. And I don't, you know, despite what you say about, you know, my helping you get in touch with the other Tom Hodgkinson, when the reason why I wasn't cool, and I think it remains true of me to this day, is, in my opinion, is that I think I care too much. I care about stuff. I care about what people think of me. I care about doing well. And I'm not going to argue that this is the essence of coolness, to not care, but it certainly seems to play a role in the kind of rag bag of ideas that we can find that are connected with, the kind of widespread cultural idea of what coolness means. I think that kind of indifference, that let's just say, not total indifference, but like it's hard to get to someone. It's hard to put a dent in someone who's truly cool. And I'm eminently dentable.
That is such an interesting observation. And it's really worth exploring, because I heard two things in that. One is, to be cool, you have to be somewhat untouchable in your way you approach life, that, people's reactions, people's responses don't bother you.
Right.
And in the world we're living in now, I'd almost call that just willing to shock.
Right.
Because we're seeing people just say stuff that I'm not even sure they believe, but they say to shock. And I personally don't think that's cool.
I agree with you there.
That's like a headline. If you want to be a headline, I used to say to our kids when they were little, anybody can be famous, and you can do it for all the wrong reasons.
Right. Well, this takes us to another little conundrum or mystery, I think, which involved in what coolness is, which is to say that our idea of what it is usually comes from the most famous examples of that. And yet, as you just pointed out, it's actually fame itself isn't that cool, or the truly cool person wouldn't care about fame.
Exactly.
So the coolest people on the planet actually are almost certainly people we haven't heard of and have never met. I mean, unless you're blessed with some very cool friends, which is possible.
Which, like you, who's now one of my friends.
Right. Yes. But yeah, so there's a lot about the very idea, and I think for me it makes it more interesting. But the very idea of talking about cool, that's sort of self-defeating, but you can have an interesting journey at the same time. You kind of feel like there's no way I'm ever going to get there, but the journey will be interesting. So it's this idea of, it's inherently uncool to write a book about how to be cool, because, if you really were cool, you would just get on with it. Being cool, you wouldn't, geek it up and go and sit in the library and try to analyze it. You'd just be, because it's this is another thing that I've been thinking recently, Diane, because, before coming on to chat with you, I obviously enough, I did some thinking, because, as you say, it's been a year or two since the book came out, and I thought I would try and update in my own head some of my views, and I came to this thought that that if you this whole, I came back to this whole conundrum of just the chasing of being cool is itself uncool. And the reason for that, I'm coming to my point now. I kind of got lost for a moment there in my head, but I'm going to come to it now. I remember what I was going to say. What I've realized is that, what I think I've realized is that to be cool is a state of being rather than a series of actions. It's more about who you are than it's about what you do. And this is incredibly liberating. And I think it's not a coincidence, the way that it links back into the kind of historical cultural origins of coolness, which go back to, you can debate this, but which go back to kind of like the first decades of the 20th century, and particularly ideas of coolness came out of the jazz scene in America, and specifically Black culture, African American culture. And one of the reasons for this, I think, and one of the reasons why coolness is also to this day still so prevalent among young people, is because it actually stems from a feeling of powerlessness or a feeling of blockedness. You can obviously argue that young people have power of a certain kind. You could argue that, Black Americans in the 1920s could have power of a certain kind. But there was clearly certain, institutional, structural ways in which that power was denied. And so what it meant was, I think, what it meant was that the two major options for an ordinary life philosophy that people tend to embrace in one form or another, which are namely whether you're going to devote your life to the accumulation of wealth and building a nice home for yourself and your family, and just getting bigger, or whether you're going to try and be morally good, to devote yourself to being a morally good person. These are not incompatible, but these are two quite separate ideas. And now I think the idea is that when you're blocked or in a position of powerlessness, you certainly feel denied a sort of fair path to wealth creation, or to wealth, to becoming richer, and to some extent you're denied the path to being good as well, because if you're really the underdog, you're kind of told, like, whatever you do, no one's going to really accept that you're good. And so you ask yourself, well, what's left? And what's left, it seems to me that the idea of coolness developed as a kind of third way. It's a third option, a third way you can live your life. And it's, if you could look at it this way: if you feel that you're denied a future, or that the future is uncertain, you have one option, which is living in the present. And that would involve having an entirely separate value structure for how you live your life. And it's about how you are, how you comport yourself, your style, your attitude. And these things don't presuppose concrete achievements in the world. You don't have to build a company or be promoted at work in order to achieve that. In fact, one of the most empowering things about it, I think, is that it's something that you could achieve tomorrow. It's a shift in the mind. And I remember feeling that I witnessed this myself firsthand when I was at school. I mean, it's, I don't want to say that, give the impression that this book is all about some sort of playing out of my school experiences, but I'm sure that's true to some extent.
Yeah.
But when I was at school, there was definitely a kind of cool crowd, and if you weren't in it, you weren't in it. And I remember once there was this friend of mine, the same age as me, this guy who was like classically uncool. He was, I don't know, he had glasses and he was a bit geeky and bookish, and he seemed to care too much and all of that. And then one day he just decided he was going to be cool. And I remember like, the cool guys used to smoke. And they said there would be a moment at school where I went to a boarding school. There'd be a moment when the cool guys would get up to go outside for a cigarette. I remember this uncool kid, he got up and went with them. Sort of naysayers like me were like, "Where are you going? Like, what do you think you're doing? Who do you think you are?" Trying to police the groups. But that was it. The die was cast. He was cool ever afterwards. So, but I love that. I love the fact. I mean, I never did it, but I love the fact that this is something that you can fix tomorrow, if should you wish to. But I think that there's a sort of softer version of that as well, which doesn't necessarily involve embracing coolness in some kind of classic or old-fashioned, idea of sort of Steve McQueen coolness. But it seems to me that when you think about the way you live, you can always break it down into these two questions, and it might be a useful way to think about it. And the two questions are, what are you going to do, and how are you going to be? And what are you going to do is not a question. It's not something that you can solve the next day. I mean, if you decide to yourself, I'm going to write a book that changes the way people think about coolness. Well, you can't do that tomorrow. It's like, good luck, check in with us again in a few years' time. We'll see how you got on. But making a decision about how you're going to be, what you want the kind of texture of your days to be like, that's something you can start tomorrow. And I love that. And it seems to me actually now that that's actually the deeper question anyway. So you can fix the more important, the deeper of the two most significant questions in life tomorrow.
Yeah. I think you've got not a revision of this book. It's part 2. because this book as a standalone is perfect as it is because of all the different people. It's history, it's characteristics. The stories are hilarious. The one about your wife I really related to because I have two of my closest friends are Russian, and
Right.
one of them one day is taking a shower in my apartment about 20 years ago, and she comes out and she says, "I hate humanity." I'm like, "Whoa, why?" She goes, "Look at what it does to my hair."
Yeah. That's fantastic.
Which reminded me of the little
So
story.
deadpan, so bleak.
and then your questions air at the end is priceless. But I think you're onto something new because, when I look at coolness, I mean, we're living in a day and age where it's like the strive to be the coolest is like, it's almost like this odd competition. But it's, I want to be cool and you have to approve of me. And that's where things go awry.
Right.
Because cool to me was, as you mentioned earlier, you're cool when you are truly in the essence of yourself. And you're not waiting for everybody to say, "Oh, they're cool," or "I approve this," or "Yes, you are the epitome." No, you just are. It's the people that attract me on the street. It's the kids that got to me in high school that I used to say, "This kid is so in his own world,"
Right.
wearing punk stuff that no one else in the school maybe was wearing, or, doing something to embrace, his super skinny body. I often think of, can you imagine going to high school with David Bowie or even Mick Jagger? They probably were kids that got teased.
Yeah, for sure.
So I always say, thank God they made it to the epitome of the top of rock and roll.
Right.
Or Freddie Mercury, different people, but they embraced it and didn't ask for somebody else to sign off on it.
Yeah, and they ended up, as you say, that they had this difference, which probably didn't serve them that well when they were, 14 or 15.
Yeah, they were probably
but they embraced it, they
kids
stuck
then.
with it, and they turned that into their thing. I was thinking about this as well earlier today. So I had the thought, which I talk about in the book, which is that, and I sort of touched on it just a moment ago, which is that coolness is always, I think, oppositional. It defines itself often against whatever is the most conventional or the most expected way to be, and which is interesting in itself, because conventions can change, they can shift, and then coolness will have a kind of comparable shift will take place. But also, it occurred to me at the same time that what's expected of you changes also as you go through life. It's not just that it changes across the culture or across cultures, it changes in your own life as you move through the different stages of your life. So what coolness might mean for you at different times in your life, you would expect might change as well. And then I realized, well, so if you find yourself when you're young, going back to my school days again, you find yourself when you're young surrounded by this cool ethos, because actually when I went to school, coolness kind of was the convention. I mean, that was the dominant culture within our little world. And so, I have a son now who's 11 years old, and I haven't had this conversation with him, but maybe I'm going to, which is, my advice to him would be not to try to join the cool crowd, but to just do his own thing in the way we were talking about, like make whatever you are into your thing. And it's not all about winning, but you're kind of winning.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I always say to people, if you can, if there's a God in heaven, and I believe there's God, and it comes to your reckoning day of, did you live a great life? Did you take advantage of the gift that I gave you, that you were a one of a kind, never to be replicated in the history of mankind? Did you own that uniqueness and share it with the world?
Right.
And I think a lot of people would have a tough time answering that question.
Yeah, it's a tough one because it's the question. I'm asking myself now, and I'm feeling uneasy.
And to me, that is cool.
Yeah. Oh, no, completely. I completely agree with you. I love that. I love that idea. I think you've put your finger on it.
And that's not putting it in someone's face and rubbing it in their face and saying, you have to approve, I'm cool. It's just this natural, I'm me.
Yes. And to go back to what you were saying, the thing you were saying earlier, Diane, just 2 minutes ago about, which I thought was spot on, how fame these days seems to be, fame squared, because it's, you want to be famous, but you also want to be getting like the constant feedback, the constant affirmation. It's this. I recently I was going to say it's like culture, the culture of getting likes.
Yeah.
And I recently reviewed a book that actually someone I know slightly called Martin Reeves, one of the cleverest people I've ever met, wrote this book about the like button. He co-wrote it with a guy called Bob Goodson. Bob Goodson was an internet entrepreneur who'd been involved actually in development. He's got a lot to answer for, this guy, in the development of one early version of the like. But what the book sort of analyzes and explains the history of is how what began as this device on our on websites or social media sites or whatever it might be, which was really just for getting feedback so people could improve their content, then started to lead the algorithms. And now those of us, and I can be guilty of this from time to time, those of us who scroll, wondering at the time we're doing it, why we're doing it, it's not quite the same, the likes, but it's all this whole addictive way of interacting with our phones has come out of, the like button has been, the sniff of cocaine or whatever at the heart of that addictiveness. And like you say, I'm just quoting you back to you now, Dan, but that thing about caring is then self-defeating, because the whole point of it is that you've got to find a place in your heart where you don't care, otherwise you're lost.
Yeah. You have to care about it. To me, it almost brings you to your internal moral compass. Who am I, and who do I want to leave this world as? And you can be extremely cool, I think, following that.
Oh, 100%. Look,
which is that next.
There's a bit of a sort of paradox here, which is that someone who is truly nihilistic, who doesn't care about anything, will probably be the most uncool person you could ever meet. They'll just be like a terrible, horrible human being. And so I completely embrace what you're saying, that there's this measure of indifference, or this measure of I'm hard to hurt. But if there isn't something that you care about, it's who are you? You just you don't exist. Yeah. The reason why I put so much emphasis on indifference is that just crops up again and again in the cultural ideas and examples we have of coolness. But what I would qualify it with is that one of my favorite, and I talk about this in the book, one of my favorite cool narratives. There are certain kind of, around any kind of cultural idea, there'd be certain narratives, certain mini stories that come up again and again. And the definitive one, I think, of coolness is the story of, and you can find it again and again, the story of someone who seems not to care about anything, but when the chips are down, that's the person who gets up and solves the problem, or whether it's leads the troops into battle or whatever it is. Somebody was needed, I mean, there's a example of this from Roman history where there was a character called Cincinnatus, and from which I believe we get the name of the city Cincinnati.
Oh.
But anyway, don't quote me on that. Check my facts. But Cincinnatus was this ordinary Roman citizen, this noble guy. But all he wanted to do, a little bit like Maximus in Gladiator, all he wanted to do was be at home with his wife and kids and till his land. And anyway, I'm going to struggle for the details here, but the barbarians were at the gates, and they came to him and they said, "We need you to help us." And he was, with a deep sigh, kind of put down his trowel. You can see how much I know about the day-to-day of farming. Put down his trowel and picked up his spear, and duly led the Roman army into battle and to a great victory. And then afterwards they said, "Hooray for Cincinnatus, you're our hero, you must become emperor, you must become our leader." And he said, "That's really not what I want. Thank you, I've done my bit, and now I'm going home to my family." He said goodbye, and off he went. And this, anyway, it's really just that moment of like the quiet guy standing up is what I'm talking about. And if you think about it in, for example, more classic cool examples of that, I mean, something like Cool Hand Luke would be an example where Paul Newman is this kind of, he's a sort of down and out, or he seems a sort of down out, he's a borderline alcoholic or whatever he is at the beginning when you meet him, and he ends up in this chain gang or like high security prison where the prisoners are being treated like animals. It's brutal what they're being subjected to, and he's the one who steps up and becomes, or to everyone's surprise, becomes the leader. This is the classical narrative. It's not about saying I don't care about anything, and then when the chips are down, you're like I told you I never care about anything. You just do nothing.
It's funny. You're raising an interesting point. I don't think indifference and caring are antonyms or opposites.
Right.
I think you can be, and I'm going to have to really think about this, but I'd like your opinion more so. I don't, you can be indifferent and you can be caring. I don't think they're exclusive.
I mean, I like that idea. It's kind of hard to get my head around it because they sound contradictory, don't they?
Right.
I instinctively know what you mean, that you can care within your indifference, or you can be indifferent without that meaning that you don't love someone, and you can do the right thing.
Yeah.
Which is a type of caring, to do the right thing. I mean, I think, I'm at in some ways, a deeply uncool time in my life, which is to say fatherhood. And why is that uncool? I mean, I don't know. I've got to, feed my kids and wipe their chin when food falls on, all that. There's a lot of mundane domestic stuff going on. But these questions kind of like arise, if you're trying to be a good dad, I wouldn't advocate indifference, but a sort of knowing what's required and being impervious to the crazed fury of the offspring. It's like, it might seem to them like you don't care, but it's not because you don't care, it's because you do care.
Yeah. When you go to Parenthood, like our kids now are 22 and 25, I'm wearing my son's brand shirt today because he is cool.
I was going to say, this is you're very much. I decided to go non-cool with my cardigan.
Well, I said I'm gonna. I said to our son today, you just released this new hoodie. I'm interviewing on how to be cool. I think I need to borrow one of your hoodies.
Well, I'm so glad you made an effort. You definitely outcool me.
But it's funny, the different stages of your life. When you're kids, you said your son's 10. Under 10, you're the coolest person in the world to that child.
Not anymore.
Well, exactly. Right around 10 to, whatever age, nothing. You went from knowing everything to knowing nothing. But at the same time, the biggest thing when you clear those ages, if you've been a present parent, and, our kids to this day have told me things that I almost wish I didn't have to know. I would have preferred to, maybe not have that conversation. But when they come through it on the other side, you know what you end up hearing? I know you didn't think I was listening to you, but I remember when you said.
Right.
Oh, okay.
But they say that to you?
Now.
Wow. Well done.
And I always, especially like with our son's brand, there are things he does that he is on the pulse of coolness. That if I brought myself back to my 18-year-old, 20-year-old head, I'd have said, this is really cool. But at my 65-year-old head, I'm cringing thinking, oh my God, people are going to know this is, that he's doing X, Y, Z, because it's right on the edge. It's right on the edge. It's what, it's that free-formed 18 to 22-year-old brain that just says, this is cool. This is fun.
What kind of things are we talking about, Diane?
It could be.
Do I need to worry? Are you okay?
It could be, he's going to take his silk screen, put his brand name all over the sidewalks of New York.
Right. Right.
Or he's an extreme skateboarder. He's going to do something.
I was wondering if it was that kind of, he could hurt himself, right?
Exactly. And you want to say, please don't do this. But at the same time, I'm like, this kid thinks he's flying and he loves it. And it's, got him all kinds of sponsorships and things that, you have to be the mom or the parent and you have to let the kid fly. And it's, it's the same thing with our daughter. She's off in Paris now. It's like, wow, how'd you figure out how to get there? I didn't figure out how to get there, until I was 60.
How old is your daughter?
25.
And she's in Paris?
Yeah, living there for at least a year. Got herself a visa. And I'm like, wow,
You should go.
I want to.
You should go.
I'm jealous.
But I'm interested by this going back to the kind of extreme skateboarding thing. I think I might have a section on skateboarding in my book. But one of the things which I've noticed in people's reaction to this book is some people say, that they feel that they felt quite sad reading it because there's a theme, and I don't really pick this out or analyze it, which I think is a shame, a missed trick, but we can analyze it now. Is that there's a little bit of a theme in some of these characters. So we've kind of been talking about my book, but in some ways we haven't. But just to explain what it consists of, half the book consists of 75 short entries, like a page and a half each devoted to the people who I think are the 75 coolest people, of the last 150 years, let's say, and or the last 100 years. And when I say the coolest people, I think those who I think are regarded as the coolest people. It's not really my personal choice. It's the characters around whom the word cool has sort of congregated. Mm-hmm. And so you've got some of the obvious people there, like whether it's sort of like Keith Richards or Marlon Brando or whoever, like the kind of the names that spring to mind, classic cool. When you read these entries through, it's kind of a book for dipping into, but should you choose to read it through, a lot of these guys and women came to a sticky end, or suffered. Some aspects of the way that they lived devolved into a kind of self-harm. Mm-hmm. And so you ask yourself the question, like, what's going on there? And but then if we then rewind to an earlier part of our conversation where we're talking about coolness as being a philosophy of the now, mm-hmm. that inevitably is a dangerous philosophy. That's why it's not the conventional philosophy. You know, most people think like we should live a little bit more carefully than that. You know, things can go wrong. The future is uncertain. Let's have some safety nets in place. Let's pay our insurance. But if you live a philosophy of now, that's inevitably going to be a risky way of living, and it's going to involve, and it's likely to lead to the embrace of risky activities as well, whether that's, you know, extreme skateboarding or you know, drug taking or you know, I don't know, not getting enough sleep, whatever. You know,
well, you know, there's self-destructive things and there's things in the moment. So for example, I love the topic of death, and it started, I had 3 plane crashes within a year and a half period. And then I had a 4th one about 5 years later. And that's a whole other story. But one of the things it really made me reconcile with was that you have no idea what's going to happen next in life. You have no idea. And there are so many things you have no control over. And you spend so much time worrying about all the things of what people think. And I tell people all the time, trust me, they're not thinking about you. They're thinking about their own lives. And if they are talking about you, it's just because they have nothing else to talk about. So feel sorry for them. You know, give them some slack, let them go, because they're trying to catch up in some way. And they're using you as their example to talk about. So either way, it's all good. It all depends on what lens you want to put through it. But life is short. And the minute you accept that death is inevitable, I think that's when you start to live now. But you live now with an appreciation for maybe some of the things that are fun versus this could be it. I don't want to.
This is so interesting what you're saying,
I might not be able to have my brain with the next day tomorrow if I live.
I think this is so interesting to me in a couple of ways. One is because it suggests that actually it's harder. Well, you could say it's harder for a young person to be truly cool because they don't understand mortality. They don't understand what death is. You need to, it's possible, but usually that realization comes at a later stage. You know, my mother died a couple of years ago, and that for sure brings it home to you. You know, as well as being, you know, in obvious ways, a very difficult time. You also can't help but realize when your parents die that you're now in the front line. You know, it suddenly got real. You know, obviously that's not all you're thinking about, but that can be part of it. And but what you just said suggests to me then that there may be these two types of coolness, because or 2 stages or whatever, because we were talking earlier on about how as you go through different stages in life, what is regarded as conventional, what's expected of you changes, and if coolness is truly an oppositional quality, then coolness will change too. But it's to key into what you were just saying, there's a little bit more to it than that. It's also that forget what you're opposing. Your essence is changing. The kind of person you are is changing. The things that matter to you are changing too. And so I love this idea that you just shared about how once you see death for the first time, like properly, like, you know, as it were, in the eyes, you can't unsee that. And then so you're living in the moment, but you're living in the moment in a different way, because it's not like, oh, I've seen that, I'm gonna live in the moment and I don't care if I die. No, you do care,
right?
So there then becomes a philosophy of now that is not reckless,
right?
But that feels wise. You're being very wise, Diane.
Well, you know, you mentioned another thing too. You know, when you talk about characteristics of cool, like I love Keith Richards. I have a pair of Keith Richards pants. I babysat for Keith Richards.
You have a pair of Keith Richards' pants. They used to belong to him.
Yeah, according to the artist who made them into like lacquered pants. I have them hanging on a wall.
I
And
thought you were going to tell me you tore them off him.
no, oh no. Oh no, he was very happily married to Patty. And, but what, you know, when I think of cool, it's a compilation, you know, which, so that, as you point out in your book, there's a lot of characteristics that go into it. If we took, let's take Keith Richards, because he's a very identifiable person and personality, I do think uber cool in many ways. But what do you know about Keith? Not only does aphoresis because he does too many drugs, falls out of a tree, whatever, you know, all these things. But if you just took the persona of Keith Richards and you removed the fact that he is one of the greatest co-lyricists and music writers and guitarists, you know, that's been around for 50 something years, maybe he wouldn't be so cool. So it's the combo that he developed serious aspects of his personality. Or we could use your example in your book, which I thought was hilarious because I love Clint Eastwood, you know, of him, oh, you know, how'd you become cool? And you talk about him flicking the cigarette up in the air and striking his match on his shoe and lighting it. I'm like, oh my God, that would slay me.
Right. And presumably he practiced
acting to the screen too, and chose perfect roles to match his personality.
Yeah, right. But what you say about Keith Richards is interesting as well, because, you know, I could relate it also to Clint Eastwood flicking up a cigarette, catching it, and then lighting it with the match that he struck on the sole of his boot while the cigarette was still twirling in the air above his head.
Uncool.
Like, you know, and he was being interviewed by Terry Wogan at the time. And he says to Terry Wogan, you know, I don't know, Terry, it just happened that way. And that you know, that, which is a barefaced lie. Because I mean, the whole point of what he just showed you is that it didn't just happen that way.
I worked on it.
No one can do that unless they've spent tragic number of hours practicing. And you know, but is it tragic? The Keith Richards, as you say, and again, you know, I think we should have co-written this book, Diane. Would have been like, you know, something else.
You inspired my thinking. You really got me thinking on so many levels.
It goes both ways. What you've just pointed out, which is you know, brilliant and obviously true, is that all of these characters in the story are incredibly talented. Well, almost without exception.
Yeah. Whether it's a poet,
there's one exception,
a model.
There's at least one exception in the book, which is Neil Cassidy, who was one of the who inspired the beatnik movement. But he wasn't actually a particularly good writer or singer or painter or anything. He was just a brilliant liver, and people were inspired by that. But in general, all of these characters, you know, you've got kind of like singer-songwriters, or you've got actors, or you've got whoever it might be, you know, sports people. But each of them has developed an extraordinary ability in a particular area, not by accident. It didn't just happen that way. You know, they put in the 10,000 hours or whatever it takes to get there, which was really uncool of them. You know, if you, but
exactly.
There's often an appearance of effortlessness, right? I mean, Keith Richards gets to the point where he's this extraordinary proficient, but then he comes on and plays as if he's, you know, okay, you know,
bored.
You're insisting.
Planet.
I will. I'll play you a couple of songs, but I mean, I can hardly be bothered. So there's always this. I mean, I'm working on a new project at the moment, which is about Oscar Wilde, which you might think doesn't have very much to do with coolness, but actually it does. I mean, he was cool before the fact, which is, you know, we're talking end of the 19th century. But he had this philosophy as well. I mean, you know, this was a gay man living in the second half of the 19th century. I mean, powerlessness, position of underdog was something he would have been extremely aware of. Also, as an Irishman in England at that time, so, what's the solution is to be just cooler than everyone else. And I can't really remember where I was going with that, but he developed this philosophy of now. He said famously, the secret of my life is I only put my talent into my writing and I put my genius into my life. And which sounds like a cheap one-liner, doesn't it? But look at the way he lived. You have to admit that his masterpiece, I mean, he's a guy who created, I won't insist on talking about Oscar Wilde for too long. It's just very much in my head at the moment. But he created several literary masterpieces. He wrote The Importance of Being Earnest. He wrote The Picture of Dorian Gray, and. But his greatest work was his life. That's the story that stays with us even more than those plays and poems.
Well, I always loved his line that a lot of people credit to Chrissie Hynde of The Pretenders because she sang it, but Oscar Wilde wrote it, which is all of us are in the gutter, but some of us are looking at the stars.
Yes.
And
that's very good, because that's the underdog philosophy again. I'm in the gutter, but I can redeem myself just by altering the line of sight.
Exactly.
What I'm looking at. I can do it, and you can do it tomorrow.
And I say that to our kids all the time. I say, listen, if you want to spend the next 15 minutes, thinking about everything, that's wrong, that you're stressed about, whatever, you can spend 15 minutes about that. But you know what? You can spend 15 minutes thinking about all that's right, that are happening, that are cool, just readjust your sight, as you just said.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You can focus on whatever you want. These are your eyes. This is your headspace. Where do you want to put it? What do you want to fill it with? I choose to fill it with cool people, that inspire my thinking, that write cool books, that make me say, wow, my brain just got expanded a little more. My thinking did. My way of seeing others and the world got expanded. That's cool.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah. So you nailed it, Thomas.
Well, thanks very much. I have a feeling that I've got to correct me if I'm wrong, but I've got a feeling that you're wrapping things up now.
I don't want to wrap things up. That's the problem. I just don't. For hours.
I don't want to launch into some long spiel if you're kind of.
No, we're going to go longer, and all those people who are working out are just going to have to do 10 extra minutes on the treadmill, because they're going to want to hear what you're going to say next, whatever that is. So
oh my Lord, you put me on the spot now. Okay. I mean, one thing that I've been thinking about, which we haven't touched on yet, is I've been thinking about why it seems to me that a lot of cool people in my book seem to have a kind of childlike quality. And I think that's true. I mean, if you think, this is true, I think, for example, of Bob Dylan, who features in the book. There's an obvious example. He always seemed like a child playing, and the ability to, if you have the ability to hang on to that quality, like, you have a long career ahead of you, because that's golden. And I think, for some reason I was thinking about this morning. I was listening to some of her music, but the Icelandic singer Björk has this. I mean, she's always been this sort of femme enfant, this very childlike quality, which, sort of like pixie dream girl has been her style. But there's this freedom in that, and it's actually arguably it's pre-cool, because the coolest person is someone who doesn't give a damn about cool. They're not even aware of that, and they're just like a 5 or a 6-year-old, and it doesn't get cooler than that.
That's really funny you say that, because one time I was talking with someone who ran this art school for at the time it was for 6 years old and under. And you think, art school for 6 years old and under, what are they doing? They're just kind of making messes. And And she said to me, she goes, Diane, all the, the Picassos, the Impressionists, all the different artists, what they wanted to do was to get back to their pre-5-year-old way of creating art, because it's free. And if you asked a 5-year-old or a 3.5-year, whoever can, when they're at the point where they can articulate, they take a picture and draw a picture, paint a picture, and you said to them, what is that a picture of? They will tell you in detail. These are the aliens coming down to Earth, and this is my mother and this is my father. And you might look at it and think, okay, never would have guessed all that, but they'll have a full story for it.
Right. Interesting.
So that's,
but something, I couldn't help thinking that if they answered like an artist and said, it's whatever you want it to be, then we'll probably have to hang them in the in the Met, in the Metropolitan Museum. I've definitely witnessed this in my own life as a parent. The artworks that your kids do before the age of like 7 or 8 or whatever is phenomenal. That's why we're so proud. That's why we show everyone.
I have them hanging all over my loft. And I just wrote about this the other day. One of our kids said to me, Mom, why did you hang that? I'm like, because it's beautiful. It's pure. Right. It's the essence of, this is how I'm seeing life right now as a 3.5-year-old. I spent more money on frames than I can count because I just loved the art.
Yeah. So good.
Yeah.
It's true.
Thomas, okay. First of all, I'm immediately buying your book, How to Sound Cultured, because you sound much more cultured than I do. And I'm going to go get that book. Nonsense. And I'm going to call you for a next interview. And I'm going to have other reasons to interview you again, because this has been just a great interview.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Dan. I've really enjoyed it too. I feel I've learned a lot.
That's how I feel. And that's what I love about these conversations. It's just a great way to meet someone and learn about them. And I just love it. And I can't tell you how much I appreciate your time today.
Not at all. It was really my pleasure. Thank you.
So everybody, Thomas and I are going to move over to the green room in a second, but I'm Dian Griesel. I'm the host of the Silver Disobedience Perception Dynamics podcast. I encourage you to subscribe, but I encourage you more to get a copy of How to Be Cool by this guy. I'm not sure which side he's going to be on when you see it. Thomas Hodgkinson. It's just a great book. And check out his other work. There'll be all kinds of links below so you can do that. Click them, follow, come back, share this with your friends, because this was one of my favorite episodes. But I have no doubt about that, because Thomas proved he was cool by doing a good deed right at the beginning of our first interaction. Thank you, Thomas. We're moving over to the green room.
Thank you.